Welcome back to Pod of the Century. Galen Clavio joining you here, along with a whole new crew of people. I found a bunch of other people who are watching the World Cup, and we're going to talk Austin Platt, Camille Good, Patrick Feltz joining us here on the show. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining. And how many of you have been up since 5 a.m.? Be honest.
No.
So I woke up probably 7, I think, right when Argentina wrapped up. I checked my phone, and I was just as shocked as the rest of you.
I wasn't shocked because I've been up since 5 o'clock. I actually woke up at like 4:50 in the morning, which means I've been almost up 12 hours now. But yeah, it was still shocking in the moment. And we're going to talk about that game and all the other games that have happened today, give some reactions to things. Camille's got some stuff to answer for here. We're going to bring him on to talk about one game in particular. But let's start with the game that just finished, actually, since that's fresh in everybody's mind. France 4, Australia 1. The Socceroos looked like they might shock the world, and it felt like that kind of a day with what happened at the beginning of the day as, you know, out of the blue, basically, you get a goal like right off the bat in this one and kind of against the run of play and a bit confusing to some degree, but Craig Goodwin, who I think was like plus 1,800 to score the first goal in this game or something like that, ends up getting the ball in perfect position, slots it past Lloris, and you're like, wow, you know, we've already had a huge upset. Could we get another huge upset? We know France is probably not on solid footing. As it turns out, that was not the way the game would go. It would take France a little bit of time, but you get the header from Rabiot in the 27th minute. That's followed by a goal from Giroud in the 32nd. And that, at that point, it kind of felt like the dream was over, and it was definitely over in the second half as France puts 2 more past and looked like they could have probably put 2 or 3 more even beyond that. Austin Platt, we're going to start with you. Your reactions to that French performance, I mean, were we right to be concerned about France, or does this kind of put all the concerns to bed?
A little bit of both. I think it's fair, considering how the day went, to be a bit concerned about the French, considering the injuries they had, and kind of emotionally knowing that Benzema, that injury was pretty late on. And I've always thought to myself, with this tournament, is it a benefit for teams to kind of play in the beginning, or does it kind of hurt them because, you know, everyone's basically played 10 days ago in their final matches in most of the continental competitions. So I kind of went back and forth with that. And I think today we saw that it could be maybe not as much of a benefit to play first, considering the guys are still kind of knocking off some rust with their international sides. And I think we saw that a bit in the beginning, but, you know, the French, the best teams in the world, will punish you and just keep going and keep scoring. We saw that yesterday with England, and we saw it again today with France. And considering how that other match in the group went, they should be feeling pretty good about themselves, that maybe the curse of the defending champion not getting out of the group could very well be over. And of course, Giroud tying a club record is pretty insane, considering, you know, he tied, you know, a legend in Thierry Henry.
Yeah, absolutely. And Patrick, you don't normally see teams that score 4 goals actually end up with that many goals in XG, but France 4.2 goals in XG in this one. They were just completely dominant throughout.
Yeah, not even a question here. And it was 18 minutes of dreaming for the Australians. Really, you know, couldn't have gone better for those 18 minutes. And then suddenly it all falls apart. But I think what impressed me the most about France is, weirdly enough, this felt like a bit of an off day for Mbappe. He was making a lot of mistakes. He had a couple misses. He was far from perfect. And yet he still ends up with a goal and assist, and they win 4-1. He doesn't have to be perfect. He doesn't have to be the Superman that he was for so many of those matches in that 2018 World Cup in order for France to be winning games and for France to not just win games, but win them in dominant fashion. And we saw that today against what I still think is a good Australia team, or at least an Australia team that's well coached, that plays together. So those are teams that can tend to win in the World Cup and that can tend to pull up upsets in the World Cup. We'll talk about one of those later. So yeah, I'm really impressed by France in this performance. You know, we all were kind of had in the back of our minds the curse, you know, thinking about when that goal goes in, maybe this curse is actually going to happen. Maybe Australia could be the upset team, knock off France, but France put that to bed here after one. Maybe the curse comes back in a different way later, but for now, it looks like the French have put it to bed.
Yeah, the one thing about this one, I'm not sure. I don't know if I totally agree with Patrick on the idea that this is a good Australia team. I mean, it's a team that's kind of bereft of stars. They were pretty well organized, but not nearly well organized enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Now, granted, it's France, and Camille, I think that's the big question was generally France trips themselves up in these games, and it's an accomplishment for them that they did nothing of the sort in this one, despite the early goal that they let up.
Right. I think that obviously everyone was talking about this World Cup curse, but I think France just got, that luck of the draw. These are probably, in terms of Australia, Tunisia, probably two of the, easiest teams you could probably get to kind of escape that curse. Australia, like you just mentioned, not really their best generation of recent World Cups. And yeah, I think France just has that firepower to still get out of the group as they showed today. They have those flashy players, but instead of Mbappe, I think that Giroud is just that he brings that stability and he can kind of balance them out a little bit, as we saw today with those 2 goals. And we talked about Denmark as this dark horse, maybe topping the group, which they can obviously still do that and beat France in that last game. But for now, I think France has enough to get by those 2 other teams.
Well, yeah, no, this was clearly, it was a great day for France, and it was a terrible day for anybody who picked against France in this group, because not only did France pick up the 3 points and a +3 goal differential, Austin, but Denmark drew with Tunisia. This was not something I think anybody had picked. I think people thought that Tunisia was going to put a similar performance into, what we saw out of Qatar yesterday, or something similar to that, or Iran. And so it ends up being one of those situations where if you thought Denmark was a trendy pick, they may still be, but at this point, it seems pretty unlikely that they would go out and top the group, given that they really needed more than 1 point against Tunisia to make that happen.
And that was by no means a match that they necessarily should have won. I mean, we'll talk about it, but that was a really hard-fought match. I think we're seeing kind of the home field advantage in a sense for some of these teams. Of course, the African Asian teams have performed much better today, as we saw in the very early match here on the East Coast. But it's no shoo-in, I don't think, for Denmark, and I think it's a huge advantage for France. We talk about kind of the mental aspect of having that win in your back pocket, and knowing that if they get 3 points in the next match, well, then they can go into Denmark and not have to really worry about doing anything, especially if they can, win by at least multiple goals. That really takes the pressure off. And for a French team that, we knew about the injuries and we kind of didn't know about everyone else necessarily, considering, they've underperformed sometimes. And there's always, the Hugo Lloris kind of a mishap, which we didn't have today. It takes a lot of pressure. And I think the French should be really pleased, and they're in the driver's seat without a doubt.
Patrick, let's talk about that Denmark-Tunisia game more closely. This was a game that it felt like Denmark was at some point maybe going to establish control, and they just never did. Tunisia really did an excellent job of pressing the action, and even though they really, you looked at their lineup, you're like, who is going to score in this lineup? It didn't really seem to matter because they kept chipping away at what Denmark wanted to do. Denmark
absolutely
essentially tried to set piece this thing to victory, and yet they were awesome at killing almost every entry that Eriksen had coming in from corners or from free kicks. Yeah, you look at the stats. Yeah, Denmark had the majority of possession. They had more shots on goal, but I came away from that really being impressed with what Tunisia had brought to the table.
I was too, and I think this is a style of play that can really work well in a World Cup. When you talk about the scoring totals in the World Cup being compared to a club match being just so much lower. The way that they can suck the life out of a team really makes me think that should they be able to get to the knockouts, and after the performance they put in today against Denmark, I think it's very possible. I think it's a very positive performance for them to get a point out of this. That's massive. So should that be a possibility for them? And we'll see if it is or isn't. I think it's on the table. I don't know if I'd call it likely. I think they could be a team to potentially pull off some sort of seismic upset. Now, granted, they don't have the talent to be able to go too far, but just the style of play, I think, could pair really well to being able to knock somebody off and catch them on a bad day.
Well, and Camille, this is going to be really interesting for this next set of matches in this group. This group's back in action on Saturday, and this is where, as we talked about before on this podcast, order of matches really matters from a psychological perspective, because Denmark has to go play France on Saturday, and Tunisia gets to play Australia. And if Tunisia can nick a goal early in that one, now suddenly they're sitting there with 4 points and you got to feel pretty good at that point if you're Tunisia.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're seeing the same situation in USA's group. Like they have to play England next, and if Wales beats Iran, they're just in the driver's seat really to maybe nick a point against England at that point if England were to beat USA and maybe not try as hardly. But I think we've seen from today signs from Tunisia that they can get all 3 points against Australia. This Australian team they struggled in qualifying. They barely squeaked out a penalty result against Peru. And I don't think I saw the right personnel, in my opinion, in terms of substitutions out of Australia for them to kind of get back at France after France got into the game. Notable is Jamie McLaren. He's sitting on the bench. I think he pairs with Matthew Leckie very well. Yeah, but I think Tunisia has that kind of grind down style where they just frustrate you a lot. And that can work against Australia. And then going into that last match, you never know how it plays out.
Well, and one other really important thing about that match that Tunisia played today, only one player picked up a yellow card, and it was a substitute. And in a group stage where 2 yellows is going to equate to a suspension, that means essentially their starting lineup, as long as they're healthy and good to go, is going to be able to play both of these remaining games. That's not the case with the Danes, where they did have 2 of their starters pick up yellow cards in the game, and now they have a much harder opponent here in this next round. Any final thoughts from this particular match between Denmark and Tunisia before we move on to the next one, guys?
Yeah, I would just say that in terms of Denmark, they have that dark horse, capability, and you touched on it earlier. I just don't think they have enough up front, and I would have liked to see Yusuf Poulsen come on at some point. I don't think Dolberg, he came up in the Euros. He can provide stuff, in spurts. But I think Poulsen, even though he hasn't played a lot for Leipzig this season, he's been consistent enough for the national team to at least sub him on, give him a chance. And I thought Tunisia did a good job dealing with those set pieces, but I still think Denmark created enough chances to put one away. I mean, I think it was Cornelius who had a header from like 2 yards out. I mean, you just have to put that in the back of the net, and yeah, that is the only concern in terms of the matchup against France, because if France can start piling on goals early, then good night. So,
Austin, do you see this Denmark team as having a chance to get a point or 3 points against France at this point?
Not necessarily. I was questioning kind of the 3-5-2 and the fact you mentioned kind of the set pieces. If Denmark goes into the match as favorites, as they most likely were, not only on paper, but in their minds they should have, they were kind of playing as if a team like an underdog, kind of trying to get those set pieces, and that can be their strength, but they probably should have been a bit more direct. And you could tell even just watching that the pressure from Tunisia really was problematic in their own half, and they really couldn't get the ball forward. And you could tell the home crowd had such a huge difference. Tunisia was playing with so much more energy, and they kind of wanted it more. And let's be honest, Schmeichel had to make some pretty big saves for them to kind of to stay in the match. Had that big one, and there was one that I know was chalked up due to offside, which has been a common theme so far on this World Cup. But it was, I don't think it was as confident as it really should have been. I know VAR kind of always finds a way to get its way into a match, which is kind of disappointing considering, we're all waiting for the assistant referee's flag to go up, and then, the ball goes in the back of the net. Hooray. Nope, it gets called off. But it was a lot closer than it probably should have. I know the stats won't tell you that, but Denmark did not play to a team that really was favored in that match, and that worries me.
Let's switch gears a little bit. You're listening to Pod of the Century as we walk you through match day 3 and our reactions to things, as we're already 8 games in, which is hard to believe at this stage that we're already that deep into the tournament, only 3 games in. But let's talk about Mexico, Poland. Wow, that was a boring game. Not a lot to recommend to the neutral, and probably Camille, maybe not a lot to recommend to the actual supporter either. This was like a case of Mexico had 0 point to the spear. Like they could not. They made a lot of lovely moves and got about 3/4 of the way into scoring position, and then blew every single one of those chances, while Poland, quite frankly, looked shocked that they were playing a game today. Like, I'm not sure if anybody told them this morning that they had to go play, but I had higher hopes for Poland in this one, and the disappointment was kind of capped off by Lewandowski biffing that free kick, which looks even worse when you compare it to what Gareth Bale did the day before. As a known Poland supporter, what were your overall reactions to this game?
Yeah, no, definitely just disappointing for Polish fans. That's not at all. I expected Poland to sit back. They've been a team that just eats the other team's possession, allows them to control the ball. But I think we saw today two teams who couldn't be lower in confidence.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think Poland kind of let Mexico grow into the game early, even though they obviously were going to allow possession no matter what. They gave them that a little bit of confidence. I thought we saw a lot of little nice moments from Chucky Lozano. But ultimately, I think in the counterattack, the decision making was very poor. It looked like some of those players, it was just too big of a moment for them, even though most of this core played in the last World Cup, and it was the same thing against. And I mean, granted, Mexico came out in droves to that stadium. I mean, it was a raucous environment. It reminds me of the last World Cup against Colombia where they came out. Not an easy environment to play in at all, but I think we didn't put our foot on the pedal at all.
Patrick, your thoughts on this one?
Well, my first thought is, wow, Memo Ochoa is still doing it. That guy, what do you even say about him? This is World Cup number 5, and he's still got it. As long as the earth is still spinning, Memo Ochoa will be in goal for Mexico. And for those of us who don't follow Liga MX too closely, he will appear every 4 years, disappear, and reappear every 4 years again. But he's been a stalwart for Club America as well in the Mexican League. But yeah, I think for Poland, my thought coming into this game was they're going to be really heavy on the counterattack and try and see if they can pull a fast one and either A, set up a goal up front with one of their two forwards, or B, set up a penalty for Lewandowski. And that's what they got, was the penalty. That was kind of what I thought the whole game was building up to, because I didn't like anything I saw from Mexico's offense today. And they got that penalty opportunity and it was saved. That's just kind of what happens sometimes. So I think for Poland, man, you really have got to be, I would say, more offensive. They've got to try and go for something. And Mexico, same thing, because, Poland wants to do this counterattacking style, all right? Eventually, you're going to have to get a goal somewhere. And if you can't get it on a penalty, then where are you going to get it? And for Mexico, I haven't liked this team throughout the octagonal, throughout really any of their recent tournaments in CONCACAF last year. They have really been struggling. It just feels like I think early in this match, they kind of controlled possession well. They had that home field advantage that Camille mentioned. Those Mexican fans traveled really well. That was impressive. And it felt like it lifted the spirits of those players. And that's a team that needed its spirits lifted, because the way they've been playing for the last year plus at this point has really felt lifeless under Tata Martino. And I think that kind of came back and crept its way in. He said it himself. He's the most wanted man in all of Mexico right now. And I kind of get it. It felt like Mexico was playing a lifeless style, and they've got to be able to turn that around if they want to make it out of group.
Well, I will say, I mean, you can't look at this Mexican team, Austin, and say that they didn't try offensively. I mean, 11 shots, 4 shots.
Yeah.
But, the thing is, I've always felt this way about when I watch Mexico at the World Cup, not at the Gold Cup, but at the World Cup. Mexican offensive moves are always predicated on the idea that their players are more skilled than they actually are. And so they get themselves in these 1-on-4 or 1-on-5 situations where it's going to take like an Mbappe level individual effort to score, and shock, it doesn't work. And that was essentially almost every offensive move that Mexico had in this one. And honestly, the fact that it took Ochoa saving their bacon and frankly, a really bad penalty take from a guy who's supposed to be a world-class striker because if that goes in, the entire narrative of this is changed. It is, well, look, Mexico just absolutely couldn't score, and Denmark absorbed all that pressure, got what they needed, and walked out of there with the 3 points. So, even though, Mexico certainly had the vibe in there, I would be concerned if I was Mexico, because I feel like Poland can win with what they did. I don't know that Mexico can win with what they did.
They were so timid in the final third, and Patrick mentioned this, how we talk about CONCACAF, how Mexico has kind of always been at the top, and they struggled to score as well. I get it. CONCACAF has improved the last 4 years. I think the Nations League has helped that, but I mean, they showed nothing kind of in that final third for as much possession as they had, and that technical ability kind of goes out the window because this is a much different roster than we saw a few years ago. Then, of course, the group that they got out of it, they beat Germany and the reigning champs in 2018 and found their way into the round of 16 into a tough draw, but they showed nothing. And I mean, this was the 0-0 snoozer that we knew was probably going to happen, considering this World Cup is filled with expectations. And I'm curious because this World Cup, you have the two groups basically playing on either end of each other on the schedule. So they both knew coming in that the Argentina match had already gone final and they knew the result. And it looked like neither of them really wanted to get 3 points and really put themselves ahead. Now, honestly, Saudi Arabia, we're going to mention them. They should be licking their chops, and they should really be excited that both these teams not only drew but didn't show anything. And I think it's interesting how everyone's going to know, if you're playing in that 2:00 window, what happens in the early match and what their response is. Of course, we saw that in the U.S. match, and maybe that had an impact, but it definitely had a negative impact. And I think both these teams might as well just put their phones away and not look at what happened, because if they did, well, that was a disaster.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, this was a game that I think either team could afford if Argentina goes out and does what everybody expects them to do, which is, beat the pants off of Saudi Arabia, clearly establish leadership in the group. Then it's like, all right, we're all playing for second. I got news for everybody. I mean, I tweeted halfway through the game, like, I think Mexico, or, I think Saudi Arabia could take a point off of either of these teams. By the time this game was over, Camille, I was to the point where I was like, I think Saudi Arabia could take 3 points off of either of these teams, the way that they played. Now, I don't want to, we'll go ahead and switch to that game, that bizarre game, as I was the only one that woke up for it of this group. But, Argentina losing that game was such a bizarre sequence of events, obviously. And, if Argentina is able to have just a little more patience on any of those goals that are ruled offside in the first half, we're basically not having this conversation at all. But Saudi Arabia was able to gain confidence and really looked equal to Argentina for a large portion of that second half, even as they were fending off a lot of their attacks. This Saudi team now has a lot of confidence. I mean, they just had their biggest win in the history of their club at the World Cup, and this is not a team that has performed well at World Cups. The last time they made it out of the group stage was all the way back in 1994 when they made it to the round of 16. This was not a team we thought was going to do a whole lot. How impressed were you by what they were able to do today overall?
Well, I'll say first, unfortunately, Patrick, I was not able to. I chose sleep over my well-being over watching this match, because obviously we all expected Messi to bag a hat trick and all of that.
We sleep in January,
right? And yeah, but looking back at the highlights and what else I could find of the match, obviously Argentina had that opportunity to dominate right away. At least one questionable offside call, like how you want to interpret that with the shoulder. If that's not a scoring, part of your body. Obviously they did enough for themselves in those opening stages, but then after that frustration, I think, at halftime only being down one, that I think that really inspired Saudi Arabia. You saw that in the opening minutes out of the break. And yeah, they did look equal. I think for Argentina, they've been on this unbelievable unbeaten streak, but still going into the tournament, there were a few questions about the midfield with Lo Celso out. They opted for Paredes, and then Romero starting. He made that kind of mistake, indecision on that first goal. And then, you're level, and then the crowd's rocking. And I think Saudi Arabia really just was fit for the moment. They were at the last World Cup, underperformed, obviously, in that group with Uruguay and Russia. But they've had the experience recently, and their coach has them buzzing now. So I was very impressed.
Yeah, no,
of course, you win the match.
You win the match. I mean, and that was one of the biggest upsets I think we've seen, certainly in the World Cup, maybe in sports. I think Saudi Arabia was an 18-1 underdog. No, it was 25-1 when the match started to win. And that's, and in soccer, of course, it's not just the win. It's also, you got the draw, which is right in the middle of it, which makes it even more of an upset. I mean, I watched the whole match. I mean, clearly, once Saudi Arabia picked up that second goal, they really did try to out-physical Argentina, and Argentina wasn't really prepared to be in that kind of a battle. And look, even with that, I mean, you always felt like the second goal was coming from Argentina, that they were going to somehow figure out a way to at least salvage a draw out of things. And it was honestly a real shock when the whistle finally blew and that hadn't happened. How we interpret that moving forward, I don't entirely know, because when you get right down to it, Argentina is still a very talented team. They've still got a lot of canvas that they can paint with in this group. And Saudi Arabia, yes, they have the 3 points, but they also have 6 players on yellow cards. 5 of them were starters in this game. That is going to have an impact probably, especially with a tough matchup coming up next, as Saudi Arabia is scheduled to I think it's on Thursday. No, on Friday. I'm sorry. No, it's Saturday. They play Poland. And then you get Argentina facing off against Mexico. So, Poland, Saudi Arabia, Austin, is going to be a pretty fascinating matchup. And we can talk about the implications of that later on. But ultimately, I don't feel too bad if I'm Argentina. This is a terrible embarrassment, but maybe it wakes your team up. But the win for Saudi Arabia really is going to have a lot of ramifications.
Oh, absolutely. We saw kind of the impact of the fans who kind of went in droves and really supported their team. And you mentioned Argentina. You look back at 2018, their first 2 matches, they only got 1 point. They drew against Iceland, who, of course, were kind of America's darling, I guess, considering they weren't in it. Of course, what they did in the 16 Euros was very impressive, and I think everyone was for them. But, they've kind of fallen off ever since then. And then they lost to Croatia, who turned out to be the big surprise of the tournament, making it all the way to the final. And it wasn't easy against Nigeria in that final match to kind of scrape one across and eventually, pull out a win, thanks to, of course, none other than Lionel Messi. Of course, becomes just the 5th player all time to score in 4 World Cups, which is awesome in and of itself, because, it's awesome to see him in one of the best generational talents we'll ever see. And it's, like 16 years between goals is like the most ever. But for Saudi Arabia, this is huge. I think Argentina, I mean, you mentioned they just didn't expect to be in that position, and they kind of didn't know what to do at the very end. But there were some key saves in there. It's not like it was just, VAR, we have to blame offsides, blame VAR, blah, 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 blah. They had chances to win, and I think there's an opportunity for them at the table. And we've seen them before, kind of looking back to, I believe it was 1990. They lost to Cameroon the year that was after, of course, the great 1986 World Cup with Maradona. So it's not like this hasn't happened before. Of course, Argentina this time aren't the reigning champs, but we've seen them overcome adversity, and maybe a wake-up call is needed in a World Cup like this.
Yeah, some great saves in that one by the keeper for Saudi Arabia, Mohammed Al-Owais. I'm glad you mentioned that. Statistically, this was I think the thing that surprised me the most in this one was, just how much Argentina blew all the chances they had. 9 corner kicks in this one, 15 shots, 6 shots on goal. And that's an effort that should win against this level of competition almost always. So you to some degree kind of have to take the result and throw it in the trash can if you're Argentina and say, well, we're just going to have to start over, and you've still got plenty of runway on all of this. Patrick, when you think about Argentina now, there's not a lot else to take out of it from my perspective, but I'm curious about yours. I mean, they don't have any yellow cards, so they're not really in any danger there. They didn't get bad performances out of a lot of their players. I mean, even the 2 goals that you saw were just like really well executed on the part of Saudi Arabia, as opposed to necessarily being like tremendous breakdowns on the part of Argentina. Certainly you would have liked to see them play a little bit better, but I don't know if you look at this result and you're like, you don't need to like second guess yourself or question yourself as a team. It's more like, well, some days you have incredibly bad days at the office. And as Austin pointed out, this is not unusual for Argentina in the World Cup. It happens more often than not. It's like they share DNA with Italy somehow in that regard, where it's like, let's start slow, guys, because, hey, we got plenty of time down the line.
Yeah, and with Argentina here, my thought is this. Number one, 3 disallowed goals for offside. That's just not going to happen in really any other match you play. For the most part, at least 1 or 2 of those are going to stand. And to that point, to Saudi Arabia's credit, they ran the offside trap to perfection. They absolutely nailed that. They had a mission coming in. They wanted to catch them offside and bug them that way. And it worked. That's exactly what they did. And they played it to a T. Couldn't have done it any better. Everything had to go right for Saudi Arabia in this match, and it did. That's not going to happen every other time you step out there on the field. And I know starting in a hole down 3 points with none on the board in your group is really tough to get out of the group stage with. What's the number we've heard during every single one of these opening round matches? 84% of teams who lose their opening match don't make it out. Well, 16% of them do. And, it isn't a very big number, but statistically, someone's going to make it out who didn't win. And I think the most likely team is going to be Argentina, right? So,
well, and especially, and going back to Camille on this, like, especially when your opponent that are most likely to be challenging you didn't get 3 points. Like,
right.
You're not dealing with, with a Poland or a Mexico that's managed to grab all the points at that point. And so that does make a big difference.
Too. Yeah. And a Poland and Mexico that weren't exactly offensive firepower, showcasing all their talent, destroying each other, going back and forth. It wasn't a 3-3 draw. It was 0-0, and neither team looked like they could do much of anything on offense. Argentina's going to be fine. I think they'll bounce back, and one or two of those offside calls will start going their way, and that's 2 more goals on the board, and suddenly it's a different result. Even a draw here, I think we're talking a little differently about it, but I think Argentina's going to be okay.
It'll make for tremendous narrative if this
absolutely
fine. And we're remember that loss to Saudi Arabia, when we're talking about the semifinals or something like that.
I think we're going to hear a lot about should Argentina turn around when Spain lost their opening match in 2010 and then ran the table.
Yeah. It's I think you're 100% on there. Camille, any final thoughts about this matchup or the game that we saw today?
I would just say, looking forward, if you're Mexico, I'd be very scared playing Argentina next. I mean, like, you're not getting that many offside the goals disallowed, and I think they're just gonna that'll really wake Argentina up. I saw nothing from Mexico, inspiring enough to break Argentina down. It really just took those moments of brilliance by Saudi Arabia, like we talked about. And on the defensive end for Mexico, some shaky moments, obviously, like the penalty. Poland really just gave them too much respect. Didn't really force them to make a lot of plays. So I still think Messi and co, they can break this Mexico defense down. It'll obviously be a very passionate match, just being those 2 countries against each other. But, I think Poland has the best opportunity out of those 2 to put themselves in the driver's seat, per se.
Yeah.
And, it's just so much worse that they drew now, because if Argentina simply wins and you draw, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, that was probably expected, but now it's like there's just no urgency. We just have to see like which team wakes up now and really goes for the kill.
Yeah, now the big question mark becomes how that next round of games, like where do we see the energy? And does Poland, I think in particular, do they try to get on the front foot? Because they weren't on the front foot in this one, and I think that's a great recipe for a 0-0 draw, which you can afford now if you're Saudi Arabia, and you absolutely can't afford now if you're Poland. So that'll make it interesting. Guys, we're going to wrap it up. We got 4 games tomorrow. Morocco, Croatia at 5. I expect you all to be awake for that. Germany, Japan at 8. These are all times Eastern. Spain, Costa Rica at 11. Belgium, Canada at 2. Austin, let me start with you. What game are you most excited to see tomorrow and why?
I know yesterday you guys chose 3 different matches, so hopefully we can get all 4. I'll start at the end. Belgium, Canada. Canada's a team that really caught my eye. They kind of rolled through. They had to play a bunch of games in CONCACAF because of their very low ranking. They played very well. This is not a team that historically is known for soccer. I mean, heck, their fan base might still be watching hockey this entire month with the way the World Cup is scheduled. So it'll be interesting how that works out. And then Belgium is a team we mentioned kind of this is their golden generation. This is kind of the final year for them. They're ranked 2nd by FIFA, and it feels like every year they have the expectations that are very, very high, and they should get out of this group, but will they go any farther? I'm looking at the 2:00 match.
Okay. Patrick, what are you most looking forward to?
Japan and Germany. I really think that this is a Japanese team that's going to surprise a lot of people. Everybody coming into this group, talking about Spain, talking about Germany. I think Japan, and we've seen Costa Rica surprise people too, look at 2014, but Japan in particular is a team I really like. They won the East Asian Cup against South Korea. They knocked off the United States in a friendly and really just dominated the United States from whistle to whistle. If you watch that friendly back in September, this is a Japanese team that always plays really well together. They play a disciplined style of ball. I think it's going to translate well to the World Cup. I could see them potentially getting either a draw here or even like a 1-0 win. And I know there's a really good German team. I like Japan a lot, though. I think that they could be one of the biggest surprises of this whole tournament.
Camille, what are you looking forward to?
I'm sorry to ruin our little streak here, but I have to agree with Patrick. This has been like on my radar the whole week. I also have Japan making it out of this group. But with Germany, so I think this first game is really like important for both teams. It's kind of bad luck of the draw for my predictions, but that they have to play each other first. But no, I think Japan has a lot of good depth in the midfield and forward positions. But on the other hand, Germany, they just suffered that World Cup curse last time out. I think they're bringing back a lot of those key players. I think they're motivated. A lot of them play with each other at club level, and I think they have that chemistry to get out of this group at the very least, and kind of respond from that just complete failure at the last World Cup. And Hansi Flick has them playing, a very more inspired type of football. But also, though, their most recent friendly did not look that inspiring. So it's yet to be seen. But this has been, I think these two teams, this could be a high-scoring game in my opinion.
I will say, I mean, as much as we talked about England not looking good in the Nations League, that didn't seem to matter at all in their first game. So maybe the friendlies we can toss out. Well, guys, you didn't leave me with much here. I will say, Spain, Costa Rica, we could have 7 goals scored in that game all by Spain. I kind of expect them to just cut Costa Rica up into tiny, tiny pieces. I mean, I'm honestly kind of interested in this Morocco-Croatia game, though, because as I think it was Camille mentioned earlier, the African and Asian teams are playing, they're kind of punching above their weight right now, Qatar being the exception. And I guess Iran, too, for totally different reasons. But, when I look at this, when I look at this Morocco team, they're not terrible. They've got some decent talent. Croatia is on the back end of their cycle from a generational perspective. They still got good players, but they're all 4 years older, essentially. So I wouldn't be shocked for that game to be competitive and Morocco to maybe nab a point, maybe even 3, as I just don't know that we know exactly what we're going to get out of this Croatia team. And Spain, look, everything you guys said about Germany, I kind of feel the same way about Spain right now. I kind of feel like they're coming in under the radar a bit, and that is a very talented team. They're not at the heights of what they did in the 28, 2010, 2012 cycle, but certainly still a force to be reckoned with. So anyway, that'll wrap it up for us. Guys, any final thoughts before we finish things here?
This was a fun day. Definitely an exciting day of matches and really starting it all off with one of the greatest upsets you'll ever see. Saudi Arabia against Argentina. I think you need to just harp on that again. That's historic right there. It's one of those you'll never forget where you were, either when you watched the match or for a lot of us, particularly on Eastern time or Central time, I know even an hour back, where you were when you woke up and saw that final score. Because, that's the magic of this sport. That's the magic of this game, is that sometimes everything can go right. You can think you know everything about it, how everything's going to turn out, and you play the game and it just doesn't happen. And that's the magic of the World Cup. It's the beauty of it. You got to play it, and you got to give your best, because who knows what's going to happen. And results like that make that clear.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think everything so far before today went as expected. In terms of these teams putting away their, inferior competition. Now we're really starting to get into this magic of the World Cup, and I think tomorrow is really just going to be another showcase of that. Like, there could be a lot of close games, especially just in between these groups, because there is heavy upset potential.
You guys hit it all. A lot of pressure on the big boys in the next 2 days in their first matches, and we'll really see if kind of playing the early games helps out the favorites, and maybe the teams that aren't expected to do as well do better, and we'll see how much this confidence kind of rolls into match day too.
Yeah, you guys did a good job of summing it up. I mean, this is why this tournament is so popular, despite all of the political and cultural and human rights issues surrounding it. This is why
Yes.
people tune in, because this is what happens. You have days like today where the unexpected just comes and waltzes right through the door, and that's why we watch sports at the end of the day. So anyway, my thanks to Camille, Patrick, and Austin for joining us on the show today. Thank you all for either watching live. You can do that after every match day. We'll be back with Match Day 4 tomorrow. You can also subscribe on Spotify or iTunes or whatever they call it now, Apple Podcast. Just search for Pod of the Century. We'd love to have you listening in throughout the course of the tournament. I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.